Greetings, students, and welcome to American Social Welfare Policy. This is the first in a series of video lectures, and we're going to start out today talking about the history of social welfare. So just to give us some context, so make sure that you actually get a chance to view your video lectures, as they're going to be very important for you as we start to look at follow-up assignments. All right, so let's talk about these antecedents of welfare. So as long as there have been societies, there has been the need for some way to make sure that societies are actually taken care of. And so this is where the notion of social welfare are actually originate. So every society on our planet, past, present, and probably future, will have some form of welfare related activity, making sure that the welfare of everyone is at least paid attention to. Um, we need to be able to do this by not judging people in terms of whether they are worthy of the help or not. There is this also need to promote the common good, and making sure that there's um, economic resources from higher class to lower class, so that everybody, in our world has a decent, fair chance, or at least there's an expectation that we as a society will make sure that none of our people get left too far behind. Also, to extend the rights of citizenship, to be belonging, to be whether that is a specific nation, for a country, for a state around the world. Those are things that are going to be important, as well as to promote social stability, and to manage lower class and economic class grievances. I mean, as we think about the world that we live in, money makes the world go round, and so access to those finances and resources are important things that we need to be mindful of as we look at the work of social welfare. So let's go back into history and just really kind of take a look at things. So there's some evidence of social welfare that dates way back and probably beyond what we have here. So this is not a complete and finite list, but more or less kind of some highlights of throughout history. So we can see back in 1750 BC, the Greeks and the Romans made daily allowances for the handicapped. Making sure that there was grain distribution for the needy and there was protection for children and women. So think about that. As far back as we can think about, some of the greater societies of that particular day actually recognized that there was a need and that not everybody in our society would have the same equal benefits that everyone else is. So, being handicapped, is not. Um, it's not something that people wish upon each other. It's something that we oftentimes have no control over, but there's also a need in society to recognize that there will be a certain percentage of people that will fall into this category, and it's our job to make sure that they're taken care of. So if we fast forward to the English Poor Laws, this was meant to control the poor. So, you've got your poor, you've got your rich, you've got your middle class, more or less. And so tax revenue was used to support the deserving poor. So those, it put a stigma on welfare in terms of, are you a deserving person or are you an undeserving person? So if you were deemed to be blind or lame or an orphan, um, you were actually the deserved poor. And so there are some esteem issues and some shaming that goes along with that particular process, but it was also an attempt to make sure that people did not stay on the system because of the stigma that was attached to it. And as you can see, that people who were drunkards or just slothful or vagrants were not considered in terms of English poor laws as being able to actually receive tax revenue support. Colonial America pretty much adopted these laws, so they came right out of England. And then there were also residency requirements, and so people also were warned out. And so, if folks, for example, um, came to a particular town and fell into the category of vagrant or drunkard or slothful, then they were warned about whether they needed to continue to live in that municipality because it was going to only be problems for them. So those were some of the requirements. And then also being in a place for a significant length of time was also going to be another key piece of social welfare. And so to this day, actually, if we think about some of our state and county systems that provide assistance for our clients that we work with, you will see that some of these residency requirements are still in effect to this very day. So as we can also see from the Civil War era, then we also came up or recognized this need that mental illness was something that we needed to address. And there was no federal legislation at that particular point in time that really dealt with that, as well as so we had to, the president at the particular time started to look at the mental health services at the federal level and started to actually allocate dollars to make sure that there was assistance for those who were suffering from those, as well as the new Freedmen's Bureau, which was really designed to help blacks who had just recently been freed to kind of set up and move into their own independence. So as we continue, and we can see this pattern start to develop, that as we move through history, as societies grow, as things change, as innovation becomes a part of our lives, then we have to do things in a different way. And so you can see as we move forward here into the 1800s, early 1900s, we've got a number of voluntary associations. So there were associations that recognized that there were things that were happening in the neighborhoods and in the cities in which they lived, and so they voluntarily provided services for some of the individuals who fell into those categories of having need. And then also spurring on the need for social welfare was this rapid industrialization. So America, as we all know, started as kind of an agrarian culture, really looking at growing products, mining, things of that particular nature. But as we started to develop machinery and cars, and as the innovations became more and more present, industrialization became a key. And you can still see that we live in a very industrialized society. Um, then we had the advent of social Darwinism. So this is this kind of evolution theory that has entered actually into social political ideology. Um, and it basically just warns that the poor will eventually overrun society. And so it's really those survival of the fittest types of mentalities that actually drove the thinking of people who were in power in terms of how they develop policy and laws. The church played a huge role as well. God's work to take care of the poor and Christian charity. And so, even to this day, there are a number of organizations that are Christian based that provide these social services. Some come to mind are the Salvation Army, Union Gospel Mission, just to name a couple, in terms of looking at the work that they do in the community to this day. Um, we also have these major providers of care that were for destitute in the 1900s, kind of the advent of social casework, social work, i.e. Jane Addams, who is a pioneer in social work, and we all owe her a debt of gratitude in terms of her Settle House movement, which was a response to the harsh economic conditions. So settlement houses popped up in different parts of the country, the Midwest, in the Far East, where there was rapid industrialization because, again, with industrialization and people moving from different parts of the country to have a chance at a better life, the more people you have, the more problems come about. And so the settlement house movement was really one that was designed to look at addressing those particular types of harsh urban conditions in a neighborhood basis by allowing people the access to organize, to learn to vote, to be responsible citizens, to find jobs, and to secure housing, things of that particular nature. So that and the Children's Aid Society were also very prevalent. Now, as you can see here, also, if you just kind of stop for just a second here and look at the African American Association, because racism and discrimination and oppression was very widespread in this country, and it continues to be so to this day. Um, and so when those government programmings were set up, when these churches were put into play, oftentimes African American folks were actually left out of that particular set of planning as well as access to those resources. So we had to kind of invent our own. And so we end up with organizations like the NAACP, the National Advancement for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, as well as the Urban League that really looked at looking at the needs of the minority communities. So as we continue to go through history, we start to see there's an ebb and a flow. And so, my own opinion is that the federal government has always had an ambivalence to social welfare policy. In other words, is it our responsibility to really be taking care of the people who live in our country? And so, opinions vacillate in terms of that. And you can see through this walk through history where a lot of these particular things um, have kind of crystallized. So 1920s, the progressive era, um, the government was responsible for protecting the interests of the public and the vulnerable. So there was this notion back in the 20s that, yeah, it's our responsibility. So roughly 100 years ago, the government decided we need to step up to this plate and really look at what's happening in this land of the free and home of the brave. The Great Depression was kind of an eye opener. The high unemployment relief was refused actually to minorities, but it also spurred the need for a number of different government programs like the New Deal, the Workforce Project, the WPA, the FHA, Social Security. All of those grew out of that depression period. And social workers, actually, believe it or not, were kind of at the helm of helping to draft some of this legislation and some of this policy. So as we move forward into the 50s and the 60s, we recognize and remember that there were all kinds of civil rights and voting rights issues. People in this country weren't allowed to vote because of the color of their skin or hold meaningful jobs. We had the need or the advent of Medicare, government subsidized medical insurance programs, food stamps, as well as CAP. So as we think about moving forward into the next decade, couple of decades, you got the 70s and the 80s, a lot of the social movement pieces were pushing around the Equal Rights Amendment. Women, if you look at the Constitution and you look at just kind of how our lives are structured, at least here in America, women have always been subjugated to second class citizens, more or less. And so this was an attempt to ratify an amendment that went on for years and years and years to make sure that women had an equal standing. And to this day, 2020, 21, 22, it's still not resolved. Gay rights were becoming a large issue. Environmental movements in terms of disindustrialization and what it was doing to our lands and the policies that originated around that Clean Air Act, and how we're going to actually take care of the planet and make sure that the toxins that were released into our communities via industrialization didn't cause health problems, and we know that there has been evidence of that. The energy crisis back in the early 1970s and 80s, where there was an oil embargo and we were dependent on foreign oil, and they raised the prices or they cut back the production, and so we ended up in situations where people just weren't able to purchase gas for their cars. We were in the midst of a war. And then there was an agricultural crisis back in 1985, having to deal with farmers and the low wages that they were receiving, as well as grain embargoes with various countries, and how farmers had to borrow tons of money at high interest rates to pay back just to kind of produce their crops. So there are a lot of things that are happening, as our society grows and continues to develop that, help us understand the need for social welfare policy. So even more history. So with the 80s and the 90s, so we, looked at mental health in the 1980s, and we passed I think Jimmy Carter was in office at this particular time, Mental Health Act of 1980, which really looked at the federal government taking a much more hands-on role in terms of community mental health. The Economic Recovery Act of 1981, and then Reaganomics in the early 80s as he was the president, looking at things like the trickle-down theory in terms of economics, that if we, invested our money at the top end, it would eventually trickle down to the folks in the working and middle classes, and that didn't necessarily pan out to be an accurate thing. We had much more awareness in terms of multicultural awareness, and then the introduction of the World Wide Web happened in the 90s, and so you can see, that all of these particular things that we grapple with in terms of looking at sociological issues, they continue to develop and they continue to impact what we do. And then more recent history, as we kind of move it forward, we can still see that there are things that are happening. There are movements that are happening. There are policy implications for these movements as it relates to various number of things. So we had the origin of, for example, the Tea Party movement, which is a conservative, anti-tax government regulation, and our number of different legislators have subscribed to this particular notion. So when you think about as policies being made, if you have an ideology that is anti-government regulation, then it often can lead to situations where larger corporations abuse their powers and take advantage of people, as we find out. The LGBTQ movement, the Indian movement is Standing Rock. Black civil rights was a continual issue since the early 50s. The passage of the Affordable Care Act, so really a comprehensive way for the nation to really look at, there are millions and millions of Americans who can't afford health insurance, and what do we do with that? What's the responsibility of the federal government? And so one of Obama's more signature pieces of legislation was this Affordable Care Act, which continues to be present to this day despite numerous attempts to from the left to actually overturn that. We had the United Farm Workers, and this was some legislation that was coming out of the western parts of the United States. It was really attempted to bar citizenship for undocumented persons. Climate change continues to be an issue. War on crime, or should I say the war on terror, cybercrime, the advent of social media networks, and finally COVID-19. So as you can see here, there are patterns that happen in our society. And so as societies evolve, as technology evolves, as innovation evolves, as people continue to grow and develop and to expand their thinking, that there's going to be the need for continual social policy. So what do we need to do in terms of looking at how we as a society take care of our own? And it has very important implications for those of us who are in social work, because this is what we do. We are charged in a large sense to not only provide direct service, meso-level services, but macro-level services. So when we start to really think about all of the things that are happening in the world around us, the impact of that does have an impact on policy, which then has an impact on people, which then has an impact on us. So just wanted to clear that piece up in terms of just kind of a little bit of a brief history of social welfare, how it started and how it continues to evolve to this very day. All right, so we're moving on to the next topic, which is, what is American social welfare policy anyway? Well, I'm glad you asked. So social policy is really social action sanctioned by society. So what does our society need? What's okay? What do we need to have in place to function at our most optimal, given that the Constitution has guaranteed us various rights and freedoms, and we have a democracy? There's also going to be this need that some social action is going to need to take place. You know, in this country right now, there are 300 plus million people who live here. They're very diverse. They come from all parts of the world, all parts of life. They come from all types of classes, beliefs, and ideologies. And when you have that many people in one space, you're bound to have some differences in terms of what some of those needs are. So social welfare policy is this subset of social policy that regulates the provision of benefits to people to meet basic life needs, employment, income, food, healthcare, and relationships. So if you think about it from a standpoint, all of the things that we have been normalized to over the course of our own lives has been in some ways tied to social welfare policy in terms of what happens. Now, how that policy gets administered is very different in terms of the mix. So you have this complicated, sometimes contingent, and sometimes parallel process in terms of mixed welfare economy. So there are a number of agencies that do social policy work, but they're on a voluntary basis. So a lot of tons of nonprofits, which hire a lot of social workers, are engaged in policy work. Then you've got the government at the county, state, and national and federal level that have to look at allocating tax dollars to take care of various needs that we talked about earlier under social welfare policy. And then we've got corporate. And so we have the corporate world, in a capitalist society that really looks at what they need to be doing also to help and to provide assistance as it relates to social welfare policy. So you've got these different environments that these things exist in. There's a social environment, there's the environment, there's the economics. And so it's about looking at what's equitable, what's sustainable, and what we can actually do. So when we think about social welfare policy, think about it from this particular lens. So now, what's the relationship? So in social work and social policy, there is also a relationship. So social work practice. So everything that you do virtually as a social worker is driven by some form of social policy. So policy does things like it determines who you serve, how long we provide services, what service we provide, when do we end, how we are paid, what we're paid. So let me give you an example of what I mean by how policy kind of determines uh, what social workers do in social work practice. So for many years, I worked as a child protection worker at a county here in the metro, Ramsey County, for a number of years. So what I found is, as I was doing my social work, I worked in case management with families who had come to the attention of child protection because either children were abused, neglected, or maltreated in some form or fashion. So there is governmental authority that allows workers to go intervene into families to see what's happening because our job is to provide a safe environment and to protect children. And so when we start to think about the money that pays the salaries or that pays for the resources, it's federal money that comes through the states in the form of acts or block grants. And so there are very specific regulations around how that money is to be dispersed and how it's to be spent. Um, so we have things like treatment plans that have to be developed when we're working with families with achievable goals that families need to be working towards. We're also looking at a time frame, so we can't work with families for forever. So typically 6 months to a year is the idea. We want to make sure that services are provided in a way to restore family functioning so children can be safely maintained at home. There are also occasions when children have to be removed from home, and so that's a legal precedent that needs to take place. And then where do we place these kids? So they're in foster care settings until parents are in a position to resolve the issues that brought them into the attention of child protection. And so the job of the social worker involves the courts, it involves the law, there are time frames, there's documentation requirements, there are case plans that need to be met. And decisions that are made. There are lawyers that are involved, there are guardian ad litems, there are judges that are making decisions about what services are needed. We often involve um, nonprofit agencies or agencies that provide specialized services like parenting or chemical health services or mental health services. So as you can see, it gets to be a fairly convoluted piece. So even as a social worker, working for a number of years in county government, my job was very highly regulated, and it was a matter of statute and policy that oftentimes originated at the federal government level that was implemented at the state and then at the county. So that's just an example of when we talk about social work practices driven by policy, that's what we're talking about. So when we think about ideology, we think about mindset. So what do people think and believe and hold true, and what values do they believe are prevalent? And so when we think about the private sector, um, and we have people who are competing for those government dollars to provide those services, um, then we see a shift when we see less public funding and more private sector pieces. So it actually ends up being a profit margin for some agencies. Not that there's anything wrong with making a profit, But the other reality is that if it takes from the public agencies who have wider discretion to actually administer fund and resources, um, then that's an important piece. This is why it's essential for you as students and as prospective social workers to have a really clear understanding of social welfare policy, which is why you have to take this class. So, when we think about social welfare and politics, there is a connection. So, when we think about the political economy, you've got these economic theories. So, there are, um, and when I say politics, I'm thinking about literally every level of politics, whether it is neighborhood, city, county, state, legislatures, the federal government, our senators, our elected congresspeople, the president, the Supreme Court, all play a role in terms of this political economy. And so there is a definite relationship between how people view money and how it's used. Um, and it makes a difference in terms of how policies are actually rolled out. So social welfare policy plays an important role in stabilizing society by influencing market forces and softening social and economic inequalities generated by the marketplace. So let me give you an example of how social welfare policy or things that are happening in our society have an impact on the market. So right now we are in the midst of a pandemic, and it has had the impact in that it has had a huge toll in terms of loss of human life. It has taxed our healthcare systems to the brink and continues to do so. It has wreaked havoc on um, employment. And so, if we think about how people actually sustain a living, we're in the midst of tons of people being out of work and not looking for work. And so that has an impact on the market forces in terms of the prices of goods, whether they go up or whether they go down, what's going to be profitable. It's going to affect 401ks. So it affects our livelihood in terms of what happens in a social standpoint. So that's why it's important for us to make that connection between the politics and the economic theories, because they have a symbiotic relationship. They drive and influence what happens. There are two major economic theories that have been around for quite some time, and they are almost juxtaposed to each other. But based on who is in office, based on what the political climate is, based on what some of the social issues are happening, um, legislators, people who make policy vacillate between these particular theories. So the Keynesian economic theory really looks at liberalism. So it's really looking at investing in human capital and increasing national wealth. So it's looking at like, well, how do we make this a level playing field kind of for all parties involved, recognizing that we all matter, and that we really need to be focusing on distributing wealth and resources to everyone, and especially the needy and some of the lower class folks as well. Where the Hayek economics looks at really more of a free market economy. So really less government regulation. Let's just kind of let the markets do their things. Bad stuff happens. Sometimes investments are going to be things that are a downturn. Um, and adjustments actually happen. So as you can see, if you've got a Congress of 535 people, and some of them subscribe to the Keynesian economics and some subscribe to Hayek, then how do you come to a resolution? How do you come to terms about what's best for the people in this country that we serve? There's also a YouTube video that's kind of funny that's here in this link that I'll put in the shell that you can kind of watch, that really kind of goes into a little bit more depth in a humorous way about these two particular theories. So now, when we start to also think about, since we know that there's a relationship between the economy, we know that there's a relationship between um, policy, and then we know that there's politics, we have to also start to then think about the ideology and the belief systems of the people who we actually elect to run our government. So here's some examples of some things that people have actually said. their mouth. Um, Former Congressman Todd Akin um, stated that it's rare for a legitimate rape victim to become pregnant. So now, if you unpack that, what is that saying? What does that say about women's rights? What does that say about the importance of protecting women from violent crimes, or that you can't become pregnant? It sends a message. Now that's a interesting position to have, but this is a person who votes on social policy legislation, how your tax dollars are spent, and if this is how he might be feeling about what happens to women, how do you think that might play out in terms of how he votes? Also, did you know that nearly half of the registered Republicans in the states of Alabama and Mississippi believe that Obama is a Muslim? So, this whole disinformation piece. And so, if I believe that and I'm not subscribing to that, how does that impact how I either support government? Because God knows we don't want to have government run by a Muslim. Um, and I say that facetiously. Senator Ted Cruz says global warming is a hoax. And we have all kinds of scientific evidence that really shows that how our planet is changing right in front of us with extreme weather patterns, with melting of glaciers, rising of sea level shores, um, wildfires that are happening pretty much all year round now. Just these weird shifts in terms of climate. But it's a hoax. And so if I believe it's a hoax, then how might I vote when there's legislation that's puts money in place to actually start to address some of these issues? I'm probably not going to vote for it if I don't believe it's real. Um, Despite the ongoing mass shootings, there's been no gun legislation passed. So think about it. Literally every month, there's a mass shooting somewhere. Schools, malls, you name it. You're pretty much safe nowhere, but there has been no real legislative push at the federal level to regulate and get ahead of some of this gun violence that's happening in our country. And, while it's a touchy subject, the other reality is as we look around the globe, there are other countries that don't have this issue, that are in the same class that America is, and they just don't have these kinds of mass pandemonium and shooting. So, what's the will and what's the reason why there's no pieces coming out of this? Rick Santorum believes that evolution is an open question. So, did we evolve from apes? And so, what is that going to have? What is it going to mean for our religious communities? So, how do beliefs and ideology of those in power influence social policy? As you can see, there's a direct link to what people say, think, and believe in terms of the whole policy piece. When we think about ideology, think about it this way: it's a system of ideas and ideals that forms the basis for economic political theory. So it's about how I see it. It's about what I believe. It's about um, whether I think people who are poor have value or not. It's about how I view people who are conservative or rich or not. Liberalism, this whole tax the wealthy to use the fund for social programs, means test public assistance, so you have to qualify for those things. Conservatism, less government regulation, lower taxes, less social spending. Um, uh, States have the right to, they're looking at having states decide about what's okay in terms of a civil rights in their particular area. And then libertarian is another ideology that we see that's kind of rapidly growing in terms of government growth occurs at the expense of individual freedom. So it's basically we just kind of want to do what we just kind of want to do. Um, and so when we think about these things, and we think about the history, the dynamic history of social welfare policy, and then as we understand the different things that impact it in terms of the economics, the elected officials, their belief systems, um, and understanding that social policy is about, how do we provide for the common good of all the people of our community, regardless of where we come from and how we originate. Again, which is why the social policy and understanding how social policy works is really important, which is going to be a key to being successful as a social worker and very important for you as you move through your social work career. So thank you for your time and attention, and I will be seeing you in one of our labs soon.